Before the first American Marine ever set foot on a Pacific island, Japanese commanders had already formed strong opinions about who these men were and, more importantly, who they were not. In the early years of World War II, Japan's military leadership viewed the United States Marines through a lens shaped by arrogance, racial ideology, and a dangerous misunderstanding of modern warfare. This miscalculation would later cost them entire islands, tens of thousands of soldiers, and ultimately the war itself. Japanese military doctrine before World War II was built on a belief in spiritual superiority. Officers were taught that the Japanese soldier, shaped by Bushido, the way of the warrior, possessed an unbreakable fighting spirit. Death in battle was not a tragedy. Surrender was. From the Japanese perspective, Western soldiers, especially Americans, were thought to be soft, materialistic, and psychologically weak. They believed Americans relied too much on technology, comfort, and firepower, and that without these advantages, they would collapse. The United States Marines were therefore dismissed as little more than naval infantry. Japanese intelligence reports prior to 1941 described American troops as poorly disciplined, individualistic to a fault, and incapable of enduring prolonged hardship. Many Japanese officers believed that if Americans faced heavy casualties early in a campaign, public opinion back home would force them to withdraw. In their minds, America lacked the cultural will to sustain brutal, grinding warfare. This belief was reinforced by racial propaganda. Japanese military education often portrayed Westerners as physically large but spiritually hollow. Americans were said to fear death, to value personal survival over duty, and to lack the collective mindset necessary for true sacrifice. These assumptions were not only wrong, they were fatal. When Japan launched its rapid expansion across the Pacific in 1941 and early 1942, its confidence soared. Victories in Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies seemed to confirm everything Japanese commanders believed. Western forces surrendered in large numbers. Entire garrisons collapsed. To Japanese officers, this was proof the enemy looked strong on paper, but broke easily under pressure, even after early clashes with American forces. Japanese commanders continued to underestimate the Marines. They saw U.S. operations as clumsy and wasteful. Heavy use of artillery and naval gunfire was interpreted as cowardice rather than strategy. They fight with machines, not with hearts, one Japanese officer reportedly wrote in his notes, but beneath this confidence lay a critical blind spot the Japanese High Command failed to understand. The unique culture of the United States Marine Corps. Marines were trained not just to fight, but to endure weeks of hunger, exhaustion, fear, and chaos. Their doctrine emphasized aggressive small unit leadership, adaptability, and relentless forward pressure. While Japanese soldiers were trained to die well, Marines were trained to win. Regardless of cost, the first real cracks in Japanese assumptions began to appear during the Guadalcanal campaign in 1942. At first, Japanese commanders believed the American landing was a temporary raid. They assumed the Marines would withdraw once faced with determined resistance. Instead, the Marines dug in and stayed. Night after night, Japanese forces launched fierce banzai attacks, expecting the Americans to break. They did not. Marines fought in the jungle, in the rain, half-starved, surrounded by disease and death, and they held their lines. Japanese officers were stunned to find that American troops did not panic under night assaults. They regrouped. They counterattacked. They adapted. Captured Japanese documents from this period reveal a subtle but important shift in tone. The language of contempt began to give way to confusion. Reports noted that American Marines were unexpectedly tenacious. Others observed that even when isolated, Marine units continued to fight with coordination and discipline. Still, many Japanese commanders clung to denial. They insisted that these Marines were exceptions, not the rule. They blamed defeats on logistics, bad luck, or naval failures, anything but the enemy's skill. Admitting the strength of the Marines would mean admitting that Japan's entire strategic worldview was flawed, yet the reality on the battlefield was becoming impossible to ignore. Japanese soldiers began to share stories whispered, at first about Marines who kept advancing despite casualties, about positions that could not be retaken once Americans dug in, about an enemy that seemed to grow stronger the longer a battle lasted. For an army raised on the belief that morale decided everything, this was deeply unsettling. By the end of Guadalcanal, Japanese commanders no longer saw the US Marines as weak. They did not yet fully respect them, but they feared them. And fear, in a military culture built on superiority, was a dangerous thing. What Japanese commanders were about to learn on islands like Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would completely shatter their remaining illusions. The enemy they had dismissed was not only resilient, he was relentless, and the war in the Pacific was only just beginning. When Japanese commanders first came into sustained contact with US Marines, the experience was deeply unsettling. Everything they believed, everything they had been taught, began to unravel under the pressure of real combat. What shocked them most was not American firepower alone, but the Marines' psychological resilience. These were not the soft, casualty-averse soldiers Japanese doctrine had prepared them to face. These men kept advancing, kept reorganizing, and kept fighting even when logic said they should break. For Japanese officers, the early Pacific battles were supposed to follow a predictable pattern. American forces would land. Japanese troops would counterattack aggressively. Heavy casualties would shock the enemy. Morale would collapse. Withdrawal would follow. This had worked against other Western armies. It did not work against the Marines. The first major realization came during prolonged engagements rather than brief clashes. Japanese commanders noticed that Marine units did not dissolve after losing officers. Junior leaders immediately stepped up. Small groups continued to operate independently, yet cooperatively, maintaining pressure even when communications were cut. This behavior was deeply confusing to Japanese officers, whose own command structure relied heavily on rigid hierarchy and centralized orders. Japanese after-action reports from 1942 and 1943 began to change in tone. Early descriptions of Americans as undisciplined were replaced with phrases like unexpectedly organized under fire and difficult to dislodge once established. Some officers expressed frustration that Marines adapted faster than anticipated, changing tactics within days, sometimes hours. In response to Japanese moves, one recurring observation appeared again and again: Marines did not fear encirclement the way Japanese planners expected. Japanese doctrine placed great emphasis on surrounding the enemy and attacking from multiple directions, believing this would shatter morale. But Marines responded by forming tight defensive perimeters, coordinating overlapping fire, and holding ground until reinforcements or supplies arrived. To Japanese commanders, this behavior felt unnatural. In their worldview, being surrounded meant defeat. To the Marines, it meant a problem to be solved. Another shock was how Marines fought at night. Japanese forces had long considered night combat their advantage. They trained extensively for darkness, believing Western troops would panic, misfire, and lose cohesion. Instead, Marines adapted quickly. They established defensive sectors, used flares, tripwires, and PRE-registered firing zones. Night attacks that were meant to terrify often ended in devastating losses for Japanese units. Japanese officers began to note something deeply troubling. Marines learned. They made mistakes early, sometimes costly ones, but they did not repeat them. Each engagement seemed to make the enemy more dangerous. For an army accustomed to fighting opponents who deteriorated over time, this reversal was alarming. Equally disturbing was the Marines' relationship with fear and death. Japanese doctrine assumed Americans would avoid close combat. Yet Marines repeatedly closed distance, even when they had the option to rely solely on artillery or air support. They assaulted fortified positions, cleared bunkers by hand, and advanced through terrain that favored defenders. This behavior contradicted the Japanese belief that Americans lacked spiritual courage. Captured diaries and interrogations revealed growing unease among Japanese junior officers. Some wrote that Marines were too stubborn or strangely fearless. Others noted that American units seemed to grow angrier rather than weaker after taking casualties. Losses that were supposed to demoralize instead hardened resistance. This was especially troubling because Japanese soldiers were trained to view morale as a finite resource. Once broken, it could not be restored. But Marines did not follow this pattern. They withdrew when necessary, but they returned. They regrouped. They attacked again. From the Japanese perspective, this bordered on irrationality. Logistics also played a psychological role. Japanese commanders were astonished by the Marines' ability to maintain supply lines under fire. Food, ammunition, medical aid, everything seemed to keep coming. Wounded Marines were evacuated and replaced. Japanese units, by contrast, were expected to fight with diminishing resources, often cut off entirely. Over time, this imbalance created a growing sense of inevitability. Even when Japanese forces inflicted heavy casualties, the strategic picture did not change. Marines did not abandon objectives. They adjusted timelines, brought in reinforcements, and continued operations. This persistence eroded Japanese confidence at every level of command. By late 1943, some Japanese officers privately admitted that their early assumptions had been dangerously wrong. However, institutional pride prevented open acknowledgement. Official doctrine still described American forces as inferior in spirit. Publicly, commanders insisted victory was possible if soldiers fought harder and sacrificed more. Privately, doubt was spreading. Japanese soldiers began to fear marine landings more than naval bombardment. A ship could leave. Artillery could stop. Marines stayed. Once ashore, they were methodical, relentless, and increasingly efficient. Positions lost to Marines were rarely retaken. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Japanese commanders were not just losing battles, they were losing faith in their understanding of war itself. The enemy they faced did not behave as expected. He did not collapse. He did not surrender. He adapted. This forced Japanese leadership into a strategic corner. If Marines could not be broken through shock and aggression, then the only remaining option was attrition, inflicting maximum casualties in the hope of slowing American advance. This mindset would lead directly to the brutal island defenses that followed, and as Japanese commanders prepared for the next phase of the war, a grim consensus began to form. If the Marines landed, the island was already lost. The only question was, how much blood could be extracted before the end? What followed would be the most savage battles of the Pacific War conflicts. That permanently changed how Japanese commanders viewed the US Marines, not as weak enemies, but as an unstoppable force of modern warfare. By 1943, the psychological balance of the Pacific War had begun to shift. What started as Japanese contempt for the US Marines slowly transformed into something far more dangerous, fear mixed with reluctant respect. This change did not come from ideology or propaganda. It came from blood-soaked beaches, shattered bunkers, and battles where every assumption Japanese commanders held was proven wrong. The turning point was not a single engagement, but a pattern. Wherever Marines landed, the outcome followed the same grim trajectory. Initial resistance inflicted casualties. Japanese forces fought fiercely, often heroically. But in the end, the Marines advanced. Always. Nowhere was this clearer than at Tarawa. Japanese commanders believed Bushido Island was impregnable. Fortified with concrete bunkers, artillery, and interlocking fields of fire, it was designed to break an amphibious assault at the shoreline. The plan was simple: drown the Marines before they reached land. If any survived, annihilate them in the open. Instead, the impossible happened. Despite horrific losses, Marines kept moving forward. Units that should have ceased to exist continued fighting. Men waded through chest-deep water under machine gun fire, dragging wounded comrades, pushing weapons ahead, refusing to retreat. Japanese officers observing the battle were stunned. This was not how Western troops were supposed to behave. One Japanese commander later admitted that Tarawa marked the moment he realized Japan could not win the war. The Marines had absorbed punishment that would have shattered any force he had previously encountered, and then they had adapted. By the third day, Japanese positions were being systematically destroyed. No dramatic collapse, no panicked withdrawal, just relentless progress. Saipan deepened the fear. Here, Japanese commanders witnessed something even more disturbing: operational dominance. Marines coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and naval fire with a precision that overwhelmed even well-prepared defenses. Japanese counterattacks, once considered decisive tools, became predictable and costly failures. At Saipan, Japanese leadership also faced a moral shock. They had told soldiers and civilians alike that Americans were brutal monsters who tortured prisoners and massacred non-combatants. Yet evidence on the ground contradicted this narrative. Marines treated prisoners humanely. Wounded Japanese soldiers were given medical care. Civilians who surrendered survived. This contradiction undermined Japanese propaganda from within. Commanders began to fear not only defeat, but ideological collapse. If soldiers believed surrender did not mean dishonor or death, the entire Bushido-based system of resistance would crumble. Orders grew harsher. Discipline became more brutal. Suicide attacks were encouraged, not just as tactics, but as psychological barriers against doubt. Then came Iwo Jima for Japanese commanders. Iwo Jima was designed as the ultimate test, a battle of pure attrition meant to bleed the Marines white. The island's defenses were unlike anything before: deep tunnels, hidden bunkers, overlapping kill zones. The objective was no longer victory, but delay. Every hour bought was a symbolic triumph, yet even here, Marines prevailed. What terrified Japanese officers was not how many Marines died, but how the Marines responded to death. Losses did not stop operations. Units rotated, reorganized, and attacked again. The battlefield became a machine, grinding forward regardless of individual suffering. Japanese defenders began to notice something chilling. Marines did not celebrate. They did not charge recklessly. They advanced with grim determination, clearing positions one by one, as if the outcome was already decided. This professionalism was deeply unsettling. Japanese doctrine glorified the dramatic final stand. Marines, by contrast, seemed focused only on completion of mission. Emotion was secondary. Survival, when possible, was valued, but failure was not accepted. By this stage of the war, Japanese commanders had stopped underestimating the Marines. Many privately acknowledged them as the most dangerous enemy force Japan had ever faced. Not because they were fearless, but because they fought effectively despite fear. Fear, the Japanese now realized, did not weaken Marines. It sharpened them. This realization forced a final shift in Japanese strategy. If Marines could not be broken, then they must be delayed. Every island would become a fortress. Every battle would be a death sentence. The goal was no longer battlefield victory, but political exhaustion. Japanese commanders hoped that the sheer cost of fighting the Marines would force America to reconsider the war. It was a gamble born of desperation, and as preparations began for Okinawa, the final proving ground, Japanese commanders understood one thing with terrifying clarity. They were no longer fighting an enemy. They misunderstood. They were fighting an enemy they could not stop. By the time the battle for Okinawa began in 1945, Japanese commanders were no longer fighting with illusions. The arrogance of the early war years was gone. The contempt that once defined their view of the US Marines had been burned away by Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. What remained was a grim, clear-eyed understanding. The Marines were not just superior in resources, they were superior in modern warfare itself. Okinawa was not meant to be won. It was meant to be endured. Japanese high command understood that Okinawa was the last defensive barrier before the Japanese home islands. There would be no retreat after this, no regrouping, no second chance. The objective was brutally simple: kill as many Americans as possible, especially Marines, and make the invasion of Japan so costly that the United States might hesitate. For Japanese commanders, Okinawa represented the final experiment in attritional warfare against the Marines. They built defenses deeper than ever before. Instead of defending the beaches, they withdrew inland, forcing Marines to advance through a maze of caves, tunnels, ridges, and fortified positions. Every hill was a trap. Every bunker was designed to survive bombardment and reopen fire once Marines moved forward. On paper, it was a brilliant defensive plan. In reality, it became a slow, grinding confirmation of everything Japanese commanders feared. Marines did not rush. They did not charge blindly. They advanced deliberately, absorbing lessons learned from earlier battles. They isolated positions, cut supply tunnels, and reduced strongpoints one by one. What shocked Japanese officers most was how unemotional the process felt. There was no sense of desperation in Marine tactics, only inevitability. Japanese commanders had once believed that the willingness to die was the ultimate weapon. On Okinawa, they learned its limitation. Marines were willing to die if necessary, but they were far more interested in surviving and winning. They used overwhelming firepower not as a substitute for courage, but as a multiplier of effectiveness. This distinction mattered. As the battle dragged on, Japanese officers observed that Marine morale did not collapse under prolonged stress. Weeks of constant shelling, rain, mud, and death wore on everyone, but Marine units rotated, rested, and returned to the line. Exhaustion was managed. Trauma was acknowledged. The system sustained the soldier. Japanese forces had no such system. Many Japanese commanders began to see the war through a new lens. They realized that individual bravery, no matter how heroic, could not compensate for a lack of logistics, medical support, and strategic flexibility. Marines fought as part of a machine, one that replaced losses, treated wounds, and learned continuously. This realization was devastating. Privately, some Japanese officers admitted that the Marines represented a new type of warrior, not bound by ritual or ideology, but by results. They did not fight to prove honor. They fought to achieve objectives. This made them terrifyingly effective. The presence of civilians on Okinawa added another layer of psychological strain. Japanese commanders had warned civilians that Marines would torture and kill them. Yet many civilians who surrendered to American forces survived. Some even received food and medical care. This reality shattered the narrative that had sustained resistance for Japanese leadership. This was catastrophic. If civilians could survive surrender, then suicide was no longer the only honorable option. If Marines were not monsters, then dying for propaganda became harder to justify. Commanders responded by tightening control, spreading fear, and enforcing obedience through coercion. But doubt had already taken root. As the battle reached its climax, Japanese commanders faced the truth they had avoided for years. They were not losing because their soldiers lacked courage. They were losing because their enemy had mastered modern warfare and they had not. The Marines were not invincible. They suffered enormous casualties. They bled. They mourned. But they adapted faster than Japan could respond. And adaptation, not sacrifice, was deciding the war. By the end of Okinawa, Japanese commanders no longer spoke of defeating the Marines. They spoke only of delaying them. Every surviving report reflected the same grim tone: admiration stripped of romance, respect born of inevitability. One officer summarized the feeling bluntly in his notes: "The American Marine does not fight as we expected. He does not seek death. He seeks completion." This was the final realization. The enemy Japan had dismissed as weak, soft, and spiritually empty had become the standard by which future wars would be fought, not through reckless bravery but through discipline, coordination, and relentless pressure. Okinawa did not just mark the near end of the Pacific War. It marked the end of Japanese commanders' faith in their own doctrine, and as plans were drawn for the defense of the Japanese home islands, many commanders understood silently, privately, that if the Marines came ashore, the outcome was already decided. All that remained was the cost. When the war ended, it did not end with victory parades for Japanese commanders. It ended in silence, defeat, and reflection. The empire they had sworn to defend lay shattered. Cities were ruins. The ideology that had guided them for decades had collapsed in a matter of months. And for the first time, Japanese commanders were free, sometimes forced to speak honestly about the enemy they had faced. It was only after surrender that the full truth emerged. In prisoner of war camps, interrogation rooms, and later in memoirs and private journals, Japanese officers began to reassess the United States Marines without the filter of propaganda or pride. What they admitted was strikingly different from what they had once believed and taught. Many commanders confessed that their greatest mistake had not been underestimating American weapons, but misunderstanding American soldiers. They had assumed that Marines fought because they were ordered to, or because they relied on technology to compensate for weakness. In reality, Marines fought because they believed in their mission, trusted their leadership, and trusted each other. This distinction mattered more than any weapon. Japanese officers were particularly surprised by the Marines' internal culture. During the war, Japanese doctrine emphasized obedience above all else. Orders flowed downward. Questioning was discouraged. Initiative beyond one's rank was often punished. After the war, commanders learned that Marine units operated differently. Junior leaders were expected to make decisions. Adaptation was not insubordination, it was doctrine. One former Japanese regimental commander remarked that Marines fought like thinking soldiers. This was not meant as praise alone, it was an admission of a fundamental difference. Marines were trained to analyze, improvise, and respond to chaos. Japanese soldiers were trained to endure it. In hindsight, endurance alone was not enough. Japanese commanders also reflected deeply on morale. Before the war, they believed morale came from ideology, from Bushido, from loyalty to the emperor, from willingness to die. Marines, they realized, drew morale from something else: confidence. Confidence in logistics, confidence in leadership, confidence that wounds would be treated, losses replaced, and sacrifices would matter. This system created resilience that ideology alone could not. Perhaps the most painful realization involved surrender. Japanese commanders had convinced themselves that Americans would torture or kill prisoners. This belief justified extreme resistance and mass suicide. After the war, many officers discovered that captured Japanese soldiers, especially those taken by Marines, were generally treated according to international law. For some commanders, this discovery was devastating. They understood that countless deaths, both military and civilian, had been unnecessary. The idea that surrender could mean survival undermined the very foundation of their wartime decisions. Several officers later admitted that fear of losing control, not honor, had driven their refusal to allow surrender. This realization haunted them when Japanese commanders started Marine operations after the war. Another pattern became clear: Marines did not seek annihilation of the enemy for its own sake. They sought objectives. Once objectives were achieved, the fight moved on. There was no obsession with dramatic final battles or symbolic last stands. Victory was measured in ground taken, missions completed, and units preserved for future operations. Japanese commanders began to see their own doctrine as tragically outdated. They had prepared for wars of spirit in an age of systems. They had trained soldiers to die beautifully, while their enemy trained soldiers to win efficiently. Against the Marines, bravery without adaptability became a liability. Several high-ranking Japanese officers later acknowledged that if Japan had possessed a force similar in structure and mindset to the US Marines, the Pacific War might have unfolded very differently. Not necessarily in outcome, but in cost. Respect, when it came, was quiet. Japanese commanders did not romanticize the Marines. They remembered the destruction, the losses, the suffering. But they respected the professionalism, the discipline, the refusal to break under pressure. One former officer summarized it simply: they were not superhuman. They were prepared. This respect extended beyond tactics to leadership. Japanese commanders noted that Marine officers shared hardships with their men. They fought forward. They took risks. While Japanese leadership often emphasized distance and authority, Marine leadership emphasized presence. That presence mattered. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt and redefined itself, military historians revisited the Pacific campaigns with new honesty. Academic studies, war games, and historical analyses increasingly highlighted the US Marines as a decisive force, not because of brutality, but because of adaptability. Japanese commanders' post-war writings often carried a tone of regret. Not regret for fighting, but regret for misunderstanding. Regret for clinging to doctrine long after evidence demanded change. Regret for teaching young soldiers that death was preferable to defeat, when survival might have preserved lives and futures. The Marines, in these reflections, became a mirror. They reflected what Japan's military had failed to become. Not heartless, not weak, but flexible, modern, human. In the end, what Japanese commanders really thought about US Marines evolved through three phases: dismissal, fear, and respect. Dismissal nearly cost them the war. Early, fear defined the middle years. Respect came too late to change the outcome, but not too late to change history. The Pacific War was one of the most brutal conflicts ever fought. It stripped away illusions on both sides. But for Japanese commanders, the Marines represented a hard truth: courage alone does not win wars. Systems do. Adaptation does. Leadership does, and those lessons learned at terrible cost would shape Japan's post-war future. The enemy they once underestimated became the standard they would never forget.